Welcome to another episode of the Cedarville Stories podcast. I'm Mark Weinstein. It's the Christmas season, the most wonderful time of the year. So who better to have on the podcast this week than award-winning author Donna VanLiere. Donna has written numerous books, including The Christmas Shoes, The Christmas Blessing, and The Christmas Note, which I recently watched the Hallmark movie that was based on her book. She and her husband Troy reside in Franklin, Tennessee, and it's my pleasure to welcome back to the podcast Donna VanLiere. Donna, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Mark.
It's great to have you. For further introduction, Donna is the recipient of multiple industry awards, including a Retailer's Choice Award for Fiction, a Dove Award, a Silver Angel Award, and 2 Audie Awards for Best Inspirational Fiction. She's been nominated for the Gold Medallion Book of the Year and is a member of the Ohio Foundation of Independent Colleges Hall of Excellence, where she is joined by such luminaries as Coretta Scott King, Hugh Downs, Senator John Glenn, and Lieutenant General Lauren Reno. Donna, she's also, I should say, the author of 17 books, including The Christmas Shoes and The Christmas Blessing. In all, 6 of her books have been made into movies. With that as a backdrop, Donna, I'm interested in learning what motivated you to get into writing Christmas-based books.
Well, Christmas-based, that's interesting because my husband managed a group called New Song. They were part of Christian music for many years. Actually, they're still part of Christian music. But many years ago, we were backstage at a concert in Knoxville, Tennessee. It was actually July. It was sweltering hot that day. I remember that. And Eddie Carswell, who's the leader, he's the founder of the group, main songwriter. He said, "Hey, Donna, I'm thinking about writing a song." And he gave me just this short 2-sentence premise of it. He said, "What do you think? Do you think that'd be a good Christmas song?" And I said, "Well, you know, Eddie, I actually think that would be a good book." And he was just kind of saying it tongue in cheek, but he said, "Well, hey, you're the writer, get to working on it." And he was just half kidding. He didn't know that I would. But on our drive back to Nashville, I was already formulating the plot in my head because whatever he told me, it was just short enough and simple enough that it just really sparked my imagination. And that book actually became The Christmas Shoes. It was a song first, obviously, because it takes a lot less time to write a song than a book. But that became the song in the book, The Christmas Shoes, and that became a movie on CBS television. It was sent to a producer in L.A., and she took it to lunch one afternoon under the premise of she's just going to go to lunch. She'll start reading it, but then she'd go back to work. But she said she sat there for the next few hours, and she finished the book. Then she went back to work and told her working partner, "I just found the next book that we need to make into a movie." And so that's how it became a movie.
Wow, that's a fascinating story. So what was it like when, or how did you get the news that your book was going to be made into a movie?
My literary agent, she called me and said that, this producer had picked it up and read it and got in touch with them and said, "We want to make it into a movie." And so she just reached out to me. And of course, I didn't really think much of it at the time because those things can fall apart in a moment. So I didn't really have high hopes at that point. I mean, it was very honoring that they thought enough of the book that they wanted to make it into a movie. But lo and behold, it actually did become a movie. Yeah,
it was a great movie. It's one of my favorite movies, especially around Christmas time. I probably see it every year. And now that I've met you several years ago, it has more meaning to me because I know really where it originated from. Has writing always been something that you wanted to do?
It was always something that I did, and I really didn't. I didn't think about it, and it wasn't until it was many years ago. I heard someone say, "You never know what one of your gifts is until someone points it out to you." And I thought, well, that makes total sense because I had always been writing and I never thought of it as a gift. I always just thought of it as, it was something that I do. You know, it was just something that kind of came easily to me. It's like someone who can, you know, sit down and play at the piano without much, you know, not a whole lot of effort to it. It's like, oh, it's just something that I do. You know, it's just part of who I am. It's like, no, that's a gift. That's a gift when something comes easily to you. That's one of God's gifts to you. And sometimes it does take someone to point it out to you and say, hey, you know, you got something there. What are you doing?
So you obviously have a gift in communicating through the written word. Do you write every day, or you wait till the Spirit leads you and something's on your heart? How does that come about?
My rule of thumb has always been, because I have children, and it's always been if they were at school, that's when I would work. But if they were at home, if they're home for Thanksgiving break, Christmas break, if they're home for summer break, then I'm not working. So that's basically how I work. If they're home sick from school, I'm not working. I work when they're in school.
That's a great mom. So when you're writing books, or you think you might write a book, what are you hoping to achieve? Does it matter what book it is, or do you have an ultimate goal for each book, or what does that sound like to you in your mind?
For me personally, when I write, regardless of what it is, I want, by the time that last page is read, I want the reader to know that hope is alive, that despite what is happening in the world, despite what's happening in their own circumstances or life situations, that hope is alive. And so that's the message that I always want to get out in any of the books. And I've written about some really hard things. I've written about the child abuse, sexual child abuse, sexual molestation. So I've written about hard things, but I always want the reader to know this isn't all there is. Hope is alive.
Yeah. And in the world we live in today, there's maybe not a more important message to communicate that hope is alive through Jesus than ever before, because we live in a dark time with all the unrest and all the garbage we're dealing with. So keep on writing, Donna. We need that. So thanks.
Thank you, Mark.
Do you ever get comments or notes from people who either have read your books or maybe watched one of the movies from your book? Do people write to you and encourage you?
Yeah, I do. I get a lot of emails, very encouraging emails. I also get some from people who get, angry with me. The book I wrote about child abuse, I got a lot of emails from people who were upset. They didn't want me to write about child abuse. One woman said, I don't even like to think about things like that happening, let alone read about them. But, sexual molestation had happened to me when I was a kid. I'm not one to stick my head in the sand, and basically told her the same thing. A lot of times when I get really nasty emails or whatever, I just ignore them because it takes too much energy to reach out to somebody like that. And they're not going to be placated anyway. They're angry for whatever reason. But when I got emails where people were saying I shouldn't have written about child molestation, that one really got to me because that had happened to me. So I answered every single one of them. I was like, I'm not letting this lie.
Yeah. So what you just said there leads me to a question I wasn't planning on asking you necessarily. So of the books that you have written, are they coming out of personal history, personal experiences, or things that you know, or where's the underlying story coming from?
That is interesting because there have been many of them that, there may be a storyline in there where it came from something personal somewhere in my childhood or from a family member, something like that. So a lot of storylines do come from that, but some of them may just come from something that I've overheard in a conversation in a coffee shop, or a little snippet of something I've read or I heard on the news. And I may just kind of craft it from there, just from getting getting a morsel of a story somewhere.
Yeah. So in the movie or book, The Christmastime, it had a strong foster care, foster system, a message in it. I also saw, at least in the movie, that there was an adoption theme as well. How did that book come about as you started penning that book? What was behind that book?
Well, the book itself is 100% different from the movie. You mentioned the movie. The only thing that was the same with the movie was the main character's name. That's it. They changed everything else. But The Christmas Town was about a woman who grew up in the foster care system. And I just really wanted to write about that because a lot of times when we meet someone, we may have some preconceived notions about them, about, gosh, that person is, not a very good person or whatever. And we have these preconceived notions without knowing anything about their background. Where did they come from? What sort of home did they grow up in? So that's why I really wanted to write about her. She was a young woman, really trying hard to make her way in the world, came out of one foster home from another because both of her parents were either in jail or in prison. So she came from a pretty hard background. And I just really wanted to explore that. What does it look like for someone who comes out of that situation and the people that she meets? And fortunately, she meets people who see a lot more in her than she sees in herself. And I would hope that's how we would all want to be, is that we would look at someone and see so much more in them than they see in themselves, and to think, wow, I could be someone who can really speak into this person's life. I could speak truth and life and hope into this person's life. And thankfully, she meets those kind of people in the book.
Yeah. And as you know from visiting and talking with your former friends or your friends from Cedarville and knowing the university, the foster care system is something near and dear to our university. We have a foster care scholarship where we award a student from Ohio a full ride scholarship. So it's important to us as a university to at least try to help in that area. But also, you've written in a book, you've had an adoption theme. And I know adoption is an important message for you, not just to write about, but to live about, because you've lived that world, the adoption world. I remember reading in the Cedarville magazine a story of your 3 adopted children, Grace, Kate, and David, which are all great stories. I love reading the magazine. But what captivated me about the adoption story in the magazine was of Grace. What was it like for you? Take us back to that period when you're in China in that hallway and you hear your name called and that baby is coming into your arms. Can you relive that memory for us?
Oh, wow. I can try. I hope I don't cry, because it really does make me cry every time. No, it's just a very, very sweet time if anybody has adopted. And for anybody who is considering it, I always tell people, because I always say, oh, it's so expensive. I don't know how we can pull it off. But I always tell people, if God wants that child in your home, He will make a way for that child to get into your home. When we were adopting Gracie, I was working as a freelance writer. And up until that point, I was getting work. It was trickling in. But when we were waiting for her and having to pay all these bills, I got more freelance work than I ever had in my life during that time. And we paid off every single adoption bill. I know a lot of people, they do GoFundMe and that didn't even exist back then when we were adopting her. They're able to get grants or whatever. But, we didn't do that. God provided the work that was needed, and we paid off every single bill. And we waited 22 months for her, which was so long. I mean, I say it was longer than the gestation of an elephant. We were waiting for this little baby in China. But when we got her, it was a crowded hotel room because we just arrived at the hotel. The plane had gotten there many hours later than it was supposed to. Got at the hotel, a lot of us in this adoption group. And they were delivering babies and luggage at the same time. So there were luggage racks filled with all these suitcases and women with babies in their arms. And so they were yelling out names. Oh, here's your luggage. Oh, here's your baby. So it was all happening at the same time. But it was just so sweet watching these babies, be put into the arms of their mom or their dad, and just to see the looks in their eyes as they were trying to figure out, this is the whitest person I have ever seen in my life. Who are these people? and they put Gracie in my arms, and I said, boy, have we been waiting for you. And she just stared at us. I mean, she had no idea what was going on or what was happening, but that was just the sweetest time. And, all those girls are 19 years old now. My Gracie is 19 years old, and she's a freshman in college. But I still remember that day like it was yesterday. It's just such a sweet memory.
For all your children, what's more difficult, the transition or adjustment for you and Troy, or for the kids?
Well, my kids were all little. They were 10, 11, and 12 months old. So there was a lot of kids, when they're adopted at the older ages. That's when there's a lot more trauma that may be involved in coming over here and trying to adapt a new way of living in a new home, that sort of thing. But for my kids, I mean, it just went off without a hitch. Kate was definitely the one who was, she would suck on her sleeve. When they gave her to us, her entire sleeve was wet because she'd been sucking on it. It was a way for her to comfort herself. And we gave her a blanket, and she just began sucking on that. And it was so loud in the hotel room, it would keep me up at night because it was so loud. She was just trying to comfort herself because the whole time she'd been in an orphanage with very little care or comfort. And so that's what she was doing. But by the time she left China, by the time we got on that plane and left China with her, she was no longer sucking on her blanket because she'd found someone to comfort her. And the change was just amazing, how she just came out of her shell during that week that we were there with her.
As you think back to your adoptions, is there any words of encouragement that you would give to people listening to this podcast who are considering adoption?
Yes, do it. It's my word of encouragement. So silly. Yes, do it. And again, I know a lot of people are afraid because it is expensive. They don't make it easy for you, that's for sure. But believe that if God wants that child in your home, he's going to make a way to get that child in your home. And it's funny because I don't even think of my kids as being adopted. They're just my kids. And during the confirmation hearings of Judge Amy Coney Barrett, I always cringed every time a reporter or something would say, and her 2 adopted children from Haiti, because adoptive parents, we don't think of them as being adopted at all. They're just our kids. And I guarantee you that Judge Barrett never thinks of, oh, these are my kids and these are my adopted kids. She just doesn't think that way. It's just not part of your vocabulary at all. If you bring a child into your home, they become your child, period.
That's a good point. Thanks for sharing that. I want to transition a little bit on the podcast from your books, Christmas Table to Christmas Shoes, etc., to lately you've been writing books related to Bible prophecy, which is really interesting to me. You've recently written The Time of Jacob's Trouble. What motivated you to write or go down the Bible prophecy path in writing books?
Well, I'll tell you the abbreviated version of it. I have been going to church, obviously, my whole life. And when I was a kid, I would hear either our pastor or a visiting pastor, even visiting missionaries. They would say things like, Jesus is coming again, or Christ is returning soon. They would say things like that. And then as I became an adult and was attending church, every Sunday, I realized several years ago, as I was sitting there, I thought, man, I think I've heard this same message at least 50 times in my life. But I'd always have to check my spirit and say, okay, there may be somebody here who's never heard the message about the prodigal son or the Good Samaritan, stuff, or Peter about to drown. But I would always have to check my spirit and say, all right, somebody's here. They haven't heard this. This is good. But over and over again, I found myself saying things like that. Like, I have heard this same message so many times in my life. And then one Sunday, I was sitting in church, and it dawned on me, I thought, a message that I haven't heard since I was a child is the message of the return of Christ. I don't hear it anymore. I mean, it had been decades since a pastor or visiting missionary had said anything about the return of Christ. And then it really became noticeable to me because each and every Sunday, and then I realized that even the word sin wasn't mentioned anymore. No, and pastors weren't talking about sin and how that separates us from God, and that there will be a final judgment on sin. So the words judgment were no longer in the vocabulary, the word wrath. And I know these are hard words. Nobody likes to hear about the winepress of God's wrath or his cup of anger. Right. You don't want to hear about those things, but it is part of the truth. It's God's word, and it's a thread in the entire scripture, all the way through the Old Testament, through the New Testament. Someone told Francis Chan once, they got kind of upset with him, and they said, "Oh, Francis, you're talking about God's vengeance, and that's only in the Old Testament." And he said, "Oh, yeah, he really mellows out in Revelation," which is true.
That's funny. Yeah.
And over the years, people have turned Revelation into metaphor. They've turned it into, it's just allegory. It's just a story. Well, we're told 7 times, 7, the number of completion and perfection. We're told 7 times in Revelation, it's prophecy. It's a book of prophecy. It's going to unfold according to God's time. And so it just became so obvious to me that pastors weren't talking about it. Some do, of course. I'm not saying all pastors, but a lot of pastors weren't talking about it anymore. Christian universities, you'd probably have to go way back in your archives to see if there's been a speaker that has talked about it at chapel. It's just not spoken of anymore. It's just not taught. And so one day it just seems like God deposited the idea into my heart, write a book that is, a lot of it be fiction, but the last part of it be biblical teaching about what people just read. Because, Mark, the statistics prove the millennials and Generation Z, they don't know anything about this because, again, their pastors haven't taught it to them. So I wanted people to be able to pick up a book, not only people our age, but these millennials and Gen Z, have them pick it up, have them get interested in it. And then in the back, there's all the biblical teaching about what they just read. I'm so grateful because I am hearing from people. I heard from one mom. She said, my daughter is 17 years old. She read this book twice. And she said, Mom, I never knew this was in the Bible. I heard from a grandmother. She said, I bought this for my 14-year-old grandson, and he read it. And then he sat down with me and he asked all sorts of questions because he didn't know about any of this that was in the Bible. That's awesome to me that I'm hearing those stories.
Keep doing what you're doing, being that bright light in Tennessee and then throughout the world. Donna, you're a delight to spend time with. Thanks for your great work in writing. And I'm glad also that the movie people love to take your books and make movies out of it because that just spreads the message even greater. And I wish you the very best. Keep writing good stuff and stay in touch and come back to Cedarville University and visit us sometime.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate you taking time today.
Thank you for listening to the Cedarville Stories podcast, brought to you by Cedarville University. Be sure to come back next week when we'll share another Cedarville story for God's glory.